Hi, everyone. Um, Dr. Christopher Sayomsky here, the Partners for Advancing Health Equity. I'm held at the Tulane University School of Public Health, Tropical Medicine. We're super excited for this next workshop series that we've been leading, which is all focused on kind of like applied approaches about health equity and equity. And today we have Chris Dimerich. Thanks for coming. He is a designer and organizer raised in Austin, Texas, on Tonkawa land. And he's worked in the architectural development, advocacy, kind of political organizations in New Orleans, across Louisiana, and throughout the United States. Chris studied architecture and political science on the Chitimacha, Choctaw, and Huma land at Tulane University, graduating with a master's in architecture and BA in political science, 2017. And he is a National Organization of Minority Architects Project Pipeline Mentor and serves on the board of NOMA, Louisiana, which is a museum here locally, organizes with Dark Matter U and the Architectural Lobby, and co-facilitates the design education activist collective, Emergent Grounds for Design Education. And then he has done some teaching at Tulane through his kind of design justice education, facilitation, and advocacy practice, preparing students, professionals to challenge unjust systems. And he's been working, he's lived in New Orleans, Broad Street neighborhood since 2018. Thank you, thank you, thank you for coming. I'm so excited to learn alongside with you today. The slides look lovely.
Awesome. Thank you, Christopher, and to everybody for joining us today. Really excited to do part one of this three-part workshop series. It's an honor to be here as part of the Partners for Health Equity Research Learning Collaboratives programming. Really have admired the work that y'all been doing for quite a while. So just really grateful to be able to be a part of it. Okay. So today's part one of the Design Thinking for Design Justice workshop series is called Unjust by Design. And as Christopher said, my name is Chris Dimrick. Use he, him pronouns. I am the facilitator of the Collaborative Design Workshop, or CoLab, here in New Orleans. So I have this kind of mascot image here that I chose to represent the session one of this series. We'll come back to it in more depth a little bit later, but it is a historic photo of the opening day of Goodrich Hospital here in New Orleans. If you live here in New Orleans, then you may be familiar with this building. You may have seen it. It's at the corner of Louisiana Avenue and Street, kind of near the Dewdrop Inn, the Magnolia Housing Project, about halfway between Tulane's Uptown campus and Central Business District. I have talked, researched a lot about, and kind of really gotten interested in the history of Flint Goodrich Hospital when I do public health work and when I talk about what design justice means in public health, because I think it can represent some of both the challenging histories of injustice that we are talking about when we're talking about the need for design justice, but then also the community-based strategies for justice, specifically in the field of health and public health and healthcare that we are drawing upon, need to draw upon in our health justice work. So like I've said, we will come to this story in a little more detail later in today's workshop. We're also going to get into it more in session number 2. But if you have seen this before, really excited to be able to talk about it today. And if you haven't, then excited to dig into the story a little bit with you as well. So today I'll have a little bit more information in my introduction of myself in the coming slides. You may know me if you're here from New Orleans, perhaps as a project manager with the Community Development Public Health nonprofit Broad Community Connections, or if you're in the design world, possibly from my work with my own practice, the Collaborative Design Workshop, or from my teaching at Tulane, which was with the Taylor Center for Social Innovation and Design Thinking, from 2021 to 23. So over the 3 workshops in this series, which I believe the first one's today, the second one is in February, and the third is in like late March, early April, we're going to cover these questions and points. How might we work toward just futures for our communities, despite the inequitable realities of the present? Over the series of sessions, we're going to apply problem-solving methods, design thinking for design justice. We're going to learn about how the social, environmental, and political histories place, not just of New Orleans, though we're going to be talking New Orleans kind of as a case study, because here, Tulane is here. Many of y'all probably are connected to here in some way. But we also are interested to talk about how these strategies apply to you and wherever you are. So that's what session 3 is particularly going to be about. Throughout today's session, I invite you to ask questions in the chat. I invite you to answer questions in the chat. If you are reading what's in there, it seems interesting to you. I love an active conversation going on between participants, especially in the chat. I may not be able to see everything that you're talking about, but this is not a one-way dialogue. I really want y'all to be engaged, to connect a little bit as well. There will be interactive points during the workshop too, where we'll be able to invite you off mute while you're writing, and I'll be able to answer questions a little bit more actively too, but that'll be a little closer. So the course breaks down into these 3 sessions. The first today is an introduction to design thinking and design justice. The second will be learning a little bit more deeply about design thinking and design justice and the applications of these practices in health equity work in the New Orleans context. And in session 3, we'll practice applying what we've learned in sessions 1 and 2 in theoretical exercise, considering some real world people and places. So learning objectives for today. So we're going to come out with a collective ability to define the key terms, design thinking and design justice. We're going to be able to describe some of the historical context in which these concepts have been developed and some of the values that you, bring to our work as practitioners in public health in the field to represent. We also want to be able to describe how current systems that we work within are unjust, who benefits from them, and who's harmed. In order to do this today, we're going to adopt a couple of community norms and expectations. So this include avoiding making assumptions as we communicate with each other, especially. We may or may not know each other, those of us who are present today, but especially for those who don't, we're going to remember that we're all human beings, people, even though we're interacting through a screen. We're going to use I language when we're talking about our beliefs and statements, not generalize. Again, speaking with care, we're people, even though we're meeting through a screen. I encourage you to turn your camera on if it helps you stay focused. There's, of course, no necessity that you do so, but I always appreciate being able to see people. Like I said, love an active chat. Challenge yourself to make space if you often talk or contribute a lot. Give other people some space to contribute, or to take space if you don't. Maybe ask a question that you're not sure that you should ask, but which you might get some more practice asking the questions that are really on your mind. And last and most importantly, take care of yourself. So I got my water, a beverage or some snack of some kind. Feel free to eat and drink and take breaks throughout the session as you need to. We're going until about 1:15, 1:30 this afternoon. So we're going to begin sort of the content program of today's session by talking about where we are. As Christopher mentioned in my bio, one way that I cite myself sort of within this space is within physical place where I am is on indigenous land because due to settler colonization of this continent, the indigenous people and histories of this place are often erased and not talked about. When they are talked about, it's often in the abstract, as if it was only a thing that happened in the past and not something that, not people, cultures that continue to exist in the present. So this slide gives us a little bit of an idea of what the landscape of South Louisiana did, of New Orleans particularly, looked like before colonization, though of course this is Bayou Sauvage east of New Orleans, so much of it does still look like this, where the city hasn't built into it. And the women here holding like traditional Chitimacha crafts are also here to remind us that their culture, the cultures of all the indigenous groups here in South Louisiana and across what we call the United States are still with us politically, culturally, contributing to our society today, not merely something in the past. A second key point to think about, especially here in New Orleans, is that we are in a nation, state, city built on stolen and devalued Black lives. I use this picture from the Ma'afa, which is a procession remembering and honoring the people who died in the transatlantic slave trade. This is a procession that happens every year in New Orleans in the middle of the summer in July. Because this is not abstract, again, this is not something that just happened in the past. It has continuing legacies and effects today, including many inequities that we see in the field of health. But it's also something that requires a bit of spiritual engagement with, I think, however we practice spirituality, to sort of comprehend what this means. It's not really an economic fact, but this is human beings and people we're talking about. And so the Ma'afa, which is a celebration that kind of combines some West African spiritual practices with Black American practices, I think is a good example of how it's a practice. It's not just like something academically talk about. Okay, so we're getting into this through some of those definitely heavy historical considerations. Also going to take a moment to close our eyes, take in a breath. And breathe out and think about what that has to do with us. Also, to put it aside for a moment and just think about here we are today. All these histories are with us, but also we are not going to only be defined by them. We are already creating, designing, practicing, living for futures that are better than what's been laid out by these horrific acts of settler colonization and enslavement. So each of you who's here today is somebody who took the effort up for a course offered by Partners for Health Equity at the Tulane School of Public Health. These are some questions I have for y'all. What do y'all feel is in this for you? Why did you choose to sign up today? Would love to see some answers in the chat. I'm gonna scroll down so I can get a sense of some of the responses too. What drew you to this course? Why are you interested in learning about these subjects? There we go, I can see. There's some responses coming in. People coming from all over the place. Want to know more about what design thinking is. Just catching up on the answers to the previous questions. People in Boston, people in Pittsburgh, Indianapolis, Central Louisiana. Welcome. Okay, so people sharing have a little experience with design thinking, not necessarily design justice. I find the two are not often talked about together as much as they should be, but pretty closely linked. So excited to do that today. I see a lot of curiosity, a lot of people excited to learn. So y'all had in an email that you would have got from the lovely folks at the Partners for Health Equity group, a set of pre-session media that you had the opportunity to read and check out. I know we're all busy. I know we're not actually, well, some of y'all might be in school, but this is not a class for credit that you're paying for. So you did not have to do the homework. I cannot make you do the homework. But if you did, would love to hear something that you remembered or noted or thought was interesting from it. Our pieces that we had in pre-session media today were the first chapter of a book called Design Justice by Sasha Costanza-Chock. This is a book that is, and y'all will have access to these links actually in the Padlet and then in an email as well if you did get access to them already. But it's a book that's available free and online, so very accessible. Sasha Costanza-Chock, who's visible in this photo on the right, they are a kind of leader in defining design justice out of the tradition that I kind of have learned it in, but they're also not like the individual who says all there is to say about it. Their work really I admire because it crystallizes, brings together a lot of different people's ideas, a lot of different people's perspectives. So even though their name shows up several times here, they're bringing and elevating a lot of people's work and theirs. Yeah, they also speak specifically to work in public health. So I think that Justice for Public Health video was really wonderful. That was from the University of Minnesota, who'd hosted that talk, but it was very, very applicable to work happening around the United States. I got a couple reflections. If you are interested for future sessions too, we'll have a set of pre-session media each time. I would say they will not, none of them will require more than about an hour of your time. If it's a video, you can always watch while doing something else. The readings may be a little more focus, but try not to assign anything too long. See if a couple folks listen to the podcast. People really, it sounds like several people were interested in like the airport scanner example that Sasha Costanza-Chock uses, which is about how the design of a device that we all know, the millimeter wave scanners that we go through in TSA security, like reifies and kind of perpetuates injustice based on like a binary idea of gender. And Sasha Costanza-Chock, as a trans person, experiences that really directly. But that's just one example of how technology, the designed environment, can act in that unjust way. But also, and this is kind of the key point that Costanza-Chock is making, it doesn't have to. And there are, this is a phrase of Antoinette Carroll's that we'll get into a little later, but for every act of design that perpetuates oppression, there's also a way that that design can be redesigned toward justice. There's a response here that technological solutions are often positioned as neutral, but they really aren't. That is absolutely true. Certainly true in health, especially. The histories of where these technologies came from, how they were invented and kind of first practiced. They have a lot to say about how they're used. Okay, there was also a survey that y'all had. This too was optional, but I am curious if there was anybody who took it. Let me know. And also if you have any reflections from it. The survey was designed about as much for y'all's benefits as for ours, really, to get you thinking about some of the subjects that'll be coming up, and about ways that from the work you do may impact how you will respond to this content. And certainly you can, even if you, haven't done so already. I think it'll be a nice little reflective tool. Today we're going to be doing a couple of participatory activities. Like I mentioned, we'll be using a tool called Padlet. So Christopher is going to be sharing that. Sorry, Christopher, I don't know if you're able to unmute yourself right now, but do you have any guidance for maybe first-time users of Padlet?
Thanks. Yeah. It's super easy to use tool, and we'll share a link when it's time. Really all you gotta do is double click and you can add comments, questions, reflections. And we're going to use that tool over the course of the three-part series to kind of see how things, also shift, reflect, change over time. So I hope that's useful.
Oh, here's for. All right. So now we're going to get to a little bit of grounding, and now y'all get to learn a little bit more about me, why I'm here, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. I chose to start this grounding here with this photo of my grandmother. Her name was Ellen Greenlobe. She was a teacher, specifically a high school chemistry teacher in public schools in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1970s and 1980s. And in that way, she's teaching something, chemistry, that's often thought of as very technical, and maybe neutral, but was also doing it in a way that was like within an environment where the way she was doing it was very important. Um, she was a white Jewish woman in the South who was teaching in a public school, was teaching and also had children, my mom and her sister, in public schools in Montgomery during racial integration. So as we'll get into, but as you may know and have some context for, public education in the United States is very segregated, certainly was legally from the post-Reconstruction era all the way up until the 1950s, until Brown v. Board of Education and its implementation in the 1960s. And so for my grandmother, being able to talk to her a little bit when I was younger about how she was never just teaching about the technical subject, she also recognized her role as somebody in a racially integrated classroom who was trying to make connections between children, people who, like herself, had been kept separate from each other. She considered that to be an important part of her work too. And I similarly have been inspired to go into teaching and inspired to do racial equity and racial justice work because of my family roots and my family story here in the South. So, as Christopher mentioned in my bio, I come from Austin, Texas, Takawa land, and curious if anybody in the chat is in Austin, from Austin. Always like to meet other Austinites out around. And there's a around. It's now one of the biggest cities in the country. Um, when I grew up there, it was definitely a smaller town, uh, more of a university and state capital sort of place, like Baton Rouge, but more fun. Sorry, Baton Rouge. Uh, Now it's like a metropolis, more than 1 million people. It's really often thought of as progressive and liberal, especially for the context of Texas. But what does that really mean in the South in the United States? I grew up in a nice white liberal neighborhood that was built off of Robert E. Lee Drive, which was like an artifact of when my neighborhood was developed in the 1960s, but also not something that was ever challenged or really commented on by white residents of the neighborhood, at least up until 2017, the Charlottesville attack. And so I spent my entire life up in this neighborhood thinking of Robert E. Lee as like a neutral name of a street and not really considering, even though I may have also learned in like a separate context who Robert E. Lee was, um, like who decided a street should be named after him, why they decided a street should be named after him, why it was important that that street was here in my neighborhood, in my white part of the city. As I grew up and learned a little bit more about why the city was the way that it was, and why I went to school where I did, I kind of began to make some connections, and that drew me into architecture and political science, the fields that I studied when I went to Tulane, because I went to a magnet high school in kind of this outlined red side of town, the east side, that had been the area of Austin into which and Latin American or Central American, Mexican American residents had been segregated by law, by policy throughout the 20th century. And so I went to a school that was intentionally created to bring white students into that part of town to fulfill racial integration court decisions. But in practice, that also didn't really happen because of strategies that we may know of from our time in education, like tracking and the accessibility of advanced classes. So I actually went to school on the second floor in these advanced classes in a predominantly white and Asian American school, while on the first floor, Black and Hispanic students got inferior classes, less investment in the neighborhood school. And that, despite having grown up in this like liberal environment, started to teach me a little bit about how someone, even I didn't know who the student was, about how our society be structured and allocating and making policy choices to that direction. So here I came to New Orleans in 2012, studied at the Tulane School of Architecture, where I also got a degree in political science. And particularly near the end of my time there, got involved in some activism and advocacy around the city of New Orleans. Some of that was around the removal of the Jim Crow era Confederate monuments, which I imagine some folks in here were also in New Orleans during that era, may remember what that was like. I believe this summer will be coming up on 7 years since that happened. But yeah, it's kind of I did my thesis about the implications of white supremacy in public space and histories of resistance to it. And that really affected the trajectory of my career. I found I couldn't just go be a traditional architect anymore once I started asking a lot of these questions. But the relationships that I made doing work around the issues started guiding me into more spaces of social justice and racial equity. Also, it sort of took me out of the, I know for folks in fields like public health, you're probably very used to being out in the field. For architects, it's a teeny tiny bit of what we do, but being interested in some more of these questions about society and space and race and history, I found myself drawn out into field work. So some of that was through a public engagement project process called Paper Monuments, which was around the question of what there should be new monuments to in New Orleans after the removal of the Jim Crow era Confederate monuments. Another, and perhaps other folks here have done this or something similar, was the US Census in 2020. I got to learn so much about our society, our state of Louisiana, meeting people, hearing people, listening to people during the census process. If you want like a crash course in field work and surveying, I cannot recommend it enough. Also government pay and off time regulations and things like that. Good times. Throughout all that, those experiences, I also spent, oh yes, people are sharing some Austin segregation plan content. Thank you for that context. I have had the opportunity to reflect quite a lot on identities and histories in my own family. Here's a couple pictures from Montgomery in Alabama, where my mom's family is from. Jewish by background, though not by religious practice. And so, especially as my grandparents passed in the mid 2010s, I found myself sort of drawn back to learn more about that, as like my direct connection to these histories is going away. And I found some really interesting stories. This top picture is the temple in Montgomery, no longer existing building, though if you've been to the Equal Justice Institute's lynching memorial there, this is actually like a block away from, the site's about a block away from there. So you've actually been in old Jewish Montgomery. And I learned that despite this like sort of overarching narrative of Jews who were, and the truth that many Jews in Montgomery in the South were complicit in, kind of silent in the face of white supremacy, that wasn't always true. The young men in the photo below are the Scottsboro boys who were falsely framed for the rape of a white woman in Alabama in, I believe, right, 1929, 1930. And I learned, kind of getting back into this Montgomery history, that the Scottsboro Boys case, though it was mostly sort of fought by like lawyers and activists in the North, there were some people in the congregation in Montgomery too who became active in advocating against the unjust framing of these young men for this false allegation of crime. And so I learned that even under these circumstances, when I've been told kind of through family history that basically silence and assent in the face of white supremacy was the way that it had been, it was actually more complicated. And there had been dissent, and there had been people in sort of, if not my own family, in my own community who had participated in this activism, going back many decades. And I that against obviously the more known history of Alabama. This is a photo, a place my parents took me when I was a kid, to the place where Jefferson Davis swore the oath of office to become Confederate president on the Alabama State Capitol steps. I don't exactly know why it's a Star of David, but it is, and that means something. And putting all these histories together has made me think quite a lot about the same topics of race and space and public memory. Certainly, I use the word apartheid with intention in this era, as we're seeing about the actions of the Israeli government in Palestine, thinking about the implication. I know how this in the United States, we know how this worked in South Africa. Where is it playing out now? Um, and I also share all this, just kind of to wrap up my own biography, because I think it's really important that we all find our reasons for participating in this kind of work. Me, as a white practitioner of anti-racist work, that looks a particular way for you, if you may be Black, if you may be Asian American, if you may have a different experience, gender, sexuality, other identities that we have, and class certainly frame the ways we can do activist and advocacy work. But it's important why you want to do this. And I'll just say, for me as a white person specifically, whiteness is partly created through the denial and the kind of pushing off of history, of our own personal histories, of vital histories. And for me, I draw a lot of strength in doing this work because I know these histories and I know how I'm connected to them. So I encourage you to do the same, as you may already be advocating and being an activist for justice in your work, or as you're kind of growing on a path into that. Yeah, I think the point of this slide is just for me to say this is things kind of a key framing question, but then also things I'm talking about a lot in a variety of contexts and in community with a lot of other people. Nobody can do this kind of advocacy and activist work alone. And that's one of the best parts about it, doing it in community. In a professional sense, I've had the privilege to do it in a couple of different contexts, including at Tulane through the Taylor Center. With my current work as project manager for the Community Economic Development nonprofit that does public health work as well, BCC, Community Connections here in New Orleans. Working in the Broad Street neighborhoods. This is photos from a survey that some wonderful Tulane public health students, Jaime and John Tasia, did of physical conditions of housing as a preliminary effort to get new investment in basically housing as a form of healthcare, recognizing that people, when they can be housed, that's a baseline for improved health, public health outcomes. So we're looking at the built environment through a public health lens. And as somebody with a disciplinary background outside of public health, I just want to give a particular shout out to these amazing students, the other public health faculty I worked with as well, who kind of brought me into this field, had showed me where we can talk to each other as practitioners across fields. This particular workshop I'm also doing through the lens of my work at CoLab, and that is the design justice, education, advocacy, visioning, and facilitation. Had the privilege of starting this in February 2020, which was a really great time to get out there with new ideas about what to do. one of the things I got doing, especially in 2020, was talking to professional audiences in a variety of spaces about what racial justice means in their work, and kind of continue to do that, sometimes in more built environment directions, sometimes less so, but that is what brings me here to y'all today. A lot of that's also public space, and involves sort of my supportive youth work as well, including through this mentoring program that Christopher mentioned that will come up a little bit in the rest of this too. So what are some of the key kind of theoretical frameworks that guide a lot of my work, that guide how I'm going to talk about design justice today? Two of them are blues epistemologies and Black ecologies. So blues epistemologies is a phrase kind of coined by the Black studies scholar Clyde Woods, who taught out of the University of California, Santa Barbara for many years. Epistemologies is a word I didn't understand until pretty recently, but it really just means ways of knowing. And Dr. Woods was talking here about ways that knowledge of local ecologies, so that's political ecologies, built ecologies, social ecologies, and environmental, can connect across place, and experiences of resistance to oppression, especially those expressed through art, through music, which is where the word blues comes from, and other forms of creative expression, can draw connections for people who experience that oppression across place. And Black ecologies, which is a framework that's been coined by the scholars Justin Hosby and J.T. Rohn, who are talking about really kind of a similar concept, but especially adapting it for the era of climate change and environmental justice. And so they're thinking of a Black ecology is like the characteristics of a place that is experiencing the effects of climate change. Many of these may be familiar to residents of New Orleans because this is kind of how we live, and the effects of toxic stewardship. So when we say that phrase, we think about the Cancer Alley kind of pollution that we have here in Louisiana, but in many other places similar around the country and the world. So these are places that struggle with a lot, but they're also places that are very powerful. And so Black ecologies is looking at the insurgent knowledge, the knowledge coming from the bottom up, from preserved histories, from traditions of resistance in these places. Which, to bring it to that last phrase, is how we can conceive of features outside of destruction. So this is a challenge I struggle with quite a lot, just personally and in my work, looking at all these historical injustices. How do we envision something different? How do we conceive of features outside of destruction? And I would propose that design thinking for design justice is one process that we can use. So we're going to begin with design thinking. If you're familiar with the concept of design thinking from past workshops or experiences, often it looks a little bit like this. It is people gathered together in space, prototyping, thinking about how to solve problems together. And this is one workshop that I had the privilege of participating in last year with a couple folks in the Tidewater building. Shout out to Tidewater if you're in that building now, or maybe have been in there. At the basic, most fundamental definition, design thinking is a process for how to think through a problem. And design thinking can be used to challenge the status quo or to maintain it. We're going to talk about a couple different approaches to design thinking in that order, since I hope we've established here that challenging the status quo is what we're here to do. I often start by referencing this diagram, the equity-centered community design process that the folks at Creative Reaction Lab, founded by Antoinette Carroll in St. Louis, have created. So this is a cycle. We are not necessarily, we can't come into a situation and be like, okay, the design thinking is starting now, because the people who are trying to conceive of these features outside of destruction have already been doing it. We, as practitioners of design thinking for design justice, come join in the work that's being done, but it's never our role just to say, okay, we're going to start solving the problem, because people have been solving the problem for a very long time. We may have things that we can offer, but we are joining this process. That involves a couple different stages, and it's kind of on us practitioners to learn what they are, to know what's appropriate for given times. You may notice there's the ideating approaches, testing and learning, building humility and empathy, and these other kind of similar phrases that will show up throughout a couple different definitions. But one thing I really like about Creative Reaction Lab's process, beside that it explicitly names equity, is the necessity of such things as inviting diverse co-creators, which we know design thinking are not neutral. We know that neutrality is sort of a position that is often adopted within homogenous spaces, particularly white spaces, male spaces, predominantly straight and cisgendered spaces. When there are diverse co-creators in the room, we cannot operate through that framework of neutrality. A little more about Antoinette Carroll, founder and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab. And there's that quote that I gave up earlier. Y'all may be able to use these QR codes. Somebody give it a try and let me know if it works. But Creative Reaction Lab's equity-centered community design field guide, I've used as a reference before in some of my own work, and really encourage y'all to check it out. Creative Reaction Lab is also sort of, I admire them because they do youth programming work specifically. It came out of Antoinette Carroll, a professionally trained designer, being in St. Louis during sort of the time of the Ferguson uprising, following the murder of Mike Brown, wanting to use her design skills, expertise, and connections to bring youth from St. Louis and Ferguson and the St. Louis area into spaces where adults were trying to solve these problems, because she knows that youth are going to provide really necessary perspectives. And obviously not every process is appropriate to like do as a youth engaged process, but many more are than we often think. And I think it is important to remember that there's always some perspectives that are being left out. It might be elders, it might be youth, it might be younger adults. And so ensuring that we're doing what it takes to go beyond sort of traditionally reachable populations is something she does a lot. I want to shout out another, yes, you will get the slides. Another really necessary practitioner to know is Dr. Leslie Ann Noel. Those of you who've been around Tulane for a little while may know that she was actually previously at Taylor Center. Now teaches at North Carolina State. And Dr. Leslie Ann Noel is a practitioner of, among other things, sort of critical race theory in design. And so that is, we hear the phrase critical race theory quite a lot these days, but what does it actually mean? It is proposing that white supremacy and racist power are maintained over time within systems and institutions. And put it that way, it I think is a little more difficult to argue. And what does that have to do with design is one of the questions that Dr. Leslie Ann Noel digs into quite a lot. She's a really great public scholar who puts out lots of podcasts, books, organizes groups to come and talk about design. There are concepts she calls the plurals. Is also really informed by her own identity as a Afro-Caribbean woman. And so she's bringing cultural practices like dance and cooking into sort of the fold of what design thinking, what makes design thinking practice work, which is really important. And I've resonated with a lot here in New Orleans too. It's like New Orleans is also an Afro-Caribbean place, and the ways that me and some of my peers here in this region do design thinking, design justice practice, also like really should be everywhere. Should be incorporating traditions like food, music, cultural practices like food, music, and dance into our work. But it's better, easier to do when those are such objectively already big parts of the culture, like they are here. So now that we've seen some more exciting and interesting design thinking processes, I also wanted to show you all what kind of the standard design thinking process that you'll hear about is. It's often presented as a 5-step process: empathize, define, ideate, prototype. Um, and I saved this for last, not to necessarily say that it's useless, but to say that it's incomplete because it's not thinking about who's in the room. It's not thinking about culture, history, power very much. So you may have seen this kind of process presented before, but if you haven't, now you know. And next time you go to a design thinking space and somebody is suggesting something like this, you can be like, oh, I know that there's actually more to this than just the simple process. So that's your charge now, is to go and expand the design thinking world for other people. Those of y'all who listened to the podcast or read some of Sasha Costanza-Chock's work might have seen some of the dangers of that. Here's some prototypes, which is one step of that process. Prototypes of a border wall created by the Customs Border Protection Agency in 2017 under the Trump administration. Certainly traditional architecture design practices, kind of follow that 5-step process. But a designer could find themselves working on something as unjust and racist and xenophobic as a border wall just by following that process without asking those larger questions. And the point of the phrase human-centered border wall, as Sasha Costanza-Chock puts it out there, if you've listened, you know, is it's an impossibility, that there are some things that we cannot have a human-centered design justice approach to because they're inherently unjust. So we're going to do our first interactive activity in the Padlet here. Christopher's going to drop that link in the chat, and we're going to have 5 minutes. We'll actually give a little bit less because we are on time. Yeah, you will have a slide in the Padlet where you'll see these questions being asked, and you can respond to them, any of them, all of them, if you'd like, in the Padlet. I think now we will also take a moment to unmute to give you all the opportunity to respond to the questions out loud if you'd like to. And also you can type them in the chat.
I'm here to help navigate if you need it. But you'll see the questions in there. And if you just double click, you can kind of add your thoughts and publish it. And you'll start to see this populating.
Are we getting much in the Padlet, Christopher?
Yeah, I will have to share some things.
Yeah.
I put you to the use of an image that someone put in there that is those little spikes that prevent the pigeons from sitting on the architecture. And they said we can do better than this.
Yeah. People use those to keep people from sitting on architecture too.
Yes. There's a big chat coming around. How it can be used as challenge status quo. Everyone's appreciating the kind of the process in between the 5 steps. Who's in the room, who's part of that conversation.
We'll give this about 1 more minute and then we will keep going.
Someone also, I appreciate it, said equity center design, and where they're thinking about it is designing with those that you are designing for.
Yep.
And it's a great summary.
There's a disability justice movement slogan, "Nothing about us without us is for us," that I believe Sasha Costanza-Chock uses in their work, and I think is a good point of reference for design justice practitioners. All right. Thank you all for responses in the past. Looking forward to checking those out. I think be mindful of time. Going to move along to our design justice portion. So what is design justice? What can it look like? kicking off this section with this photo from the National Organization of Minority Architects, which actually, Christopher, in my bio, the National Organization of Minority Architects. I'm not affiliated with the Art Museum, but we actually call them other NOMA. So NOMA is a national professional organization of architects and designers, and we do this summer camp program called Project Pipeline that is a architecture and design justice summer camp for youth. So that is working with middle and high school age kids and introducing them to the built environment design professions through a social justice lens. To do that, we go to some traditional professional spaces, but then we also take kids to places like here at the Garden of Youth Development in New Orleans to learn about histories, practices of resistance, to learn about ecology in the social, political, and of course, environmental sense. Here, we're learning about some plants in the garden. And we are doing it to kind of create and keep this culture going that our obligation as designers is not just to take the world as it is, but to change the world through our work. And that's something we have to do together. So we're going to define design justice as a set of practices for collective transformation of our unjust and inequitable status quo. So I'm going to expand on that a little bit to say design justice is grounded in principles of self-determination and sustainability, and a recognition of our identities, privileges, protections, power, and access to resources, in a commitment to ongoing learning about both historical injustice and movements for collective liberation. The Design Justice Network, which is a worldwide group of which Shasha Costanza-Chock is a part, and in her work, she's drawing a lot on the work of other practitioners in that network, has a 10-point framework and set of principles for design justice practice. These you'll also have access to, of course, so I'm not going to take the time to read all of them right now, but I'm going to call out a couple that I think are particularly important to me in my work. Centering the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the process. Before seeking new design solutions, look for what's already working at the community level. Honor and uplift traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices. Would love to hear from y'all. You can call out the number or type in the chat which ones you feel that you use in your work, that you aspire to use in your work. I always love the way that this is formatted too, because it brings some of the hierarchy of, well, it's not like a step process. It doesn't happen in a set order, but these are all things to be considering. There's a phrase it's come up a lot in some of the work I do, use circles, create circles, not lines. And I like how this is actually creating circles out of lines, doing that transformation. So yes, I see, got a response for looking at communities from an asset perspective rather than what they don't have. Absolutely. Some of us may have heard or used the language of an assets-based approach versus a deficit-based approach. So key to my practice of design justice is also not suggesting that there's one approach that is necessarily the superior approach, and incorporating always multiple points of view and frameworks into the work that I do. And so I'm going to introduce y'all to another set of design justice practices. Those are found here in the Black Space Manifesto. So Black Space is an organization of architects, planners, designers, built environment, public health practitioners who came together during the mid-2010s era, informed by the Black Lives Matter movement, activism against police brutality happening at the time, seeking to think about how that activism could lead to an agenda for anti-racial practice in space making, placemaking, placekeeping. Here are some principles that those designers have come up with that guides the continuing work that they do through the organization Black Space. I'm particularly a fan of, oh yeah, create circles, not lines. That's where that came from. It's the first one. I'm particularly a fan of reckoning with the past to build the future. But would love to hear other ones that folks connect with. Call it out in the chat. Move at the speed of trust. Yes. Which can be frustrating, especially in capitalism, because like capitalism wants us to move so fast. And being a design justice practitioner really requires some extra work to be able to slow down. Especially like the more you're doing community-based work, the harder it often is to finance projects. Yes, Sankofa, the principle of reckoning with the past, build the future. Another thing I like about the Black Space Manifesto is that they've come up with these sort of contemporary interpretations on Adinkra symbols. And Adinkra is a visual language created by Akan people in West Africa, present-day Ghana. I resonate with these a lot because a lot of the people who were brought enslaved to South Louisiana, they came from that region of West Africa. And so some of those people were craftsmen, especially metal workers, and they embedded the Adinkra symbols, and most notably the Sankofa symbol, into metalwork that you can find in the French Quarter here in New Orleans, into the built environment of South Louisiana. And so here, a group of contemporary designers is sort of reinterpreting those symbols, the values that those symbols represent, creating a new set for the 21st century. And that brings us back to Flint Goodrich. So, as I mentioned, Flint Goodrich was a hospital here in New Orleans. It was a Black community hospital that was created by really Reconstruction era public health activists, a group of women who organized as the Phyllis Wheatley Training School for Negro Nurses in the 1890s. These are women, some of them were born enslaved. Certainly their parents had lived enslaved in New Orleans and around Louisiana. And they recognized in the Reconstruction era that there was this acute need, especially in Black neighborhoods of New Orleans, for healthcare. And they created this institution to train nurses, which grew through connections with the Methodist Church and the institution that's now Dillard University into our hospital, named for the donors, Flint Goodrich. Originally, it was actually located on Canal Street in the CBD, a block away from where Tidewater is now, but moved in 1932 to the building on the right on Louisiana Avenue. And I love this picture because it shows a community investment. Many people from the neighborhood worked on this building. They worked at the hospital. They contributed funds to the hospital. They, through the insurance system the hospital had, were financially involved in making it operate. And so this really was a community enterprise institution, and people were immensely proud of it. This is, of course, during the era of Jim Crow, too, where these same people are denied access to medical care at white institutions, like Charity Hospital and Tulane Hospital. And so the necessity for this hospital was especially acute. The necessity for its public health, for its medical programs was very acute throughout its entire existence. Some of the people who contributed to this, people came from all over Louisiana, all over the South, to work here, to get care here. And some of their public health programs and approaches, particularly around maternal health care, were nationally recognized. What happened to it? If you kind of go through this neighborhood today, you'll see that the building is still there, but the institution is not. It was closed in 1982, sort of in the era when Black hospitals across the country were closing after integration of hospitals was required in the late 1960s. but there was not really an appreciation at that time for like what the specificity of skills in this history of Black medical care and public health practice could do, and also backlash to affirmative action that certainly continues today, like intentional funding of conscious programs. That appreciation didn't really exist outside of like the community of Black doctors who were associated with the hospital already. And so it was closed. Much of the history has kind of been obscured, but it's still there and still something that a lot of people are very proud of. And I kind of first became aware of this history in the course of doing a New Orleans history project, the paper monuments project that I mentioned, but then in 2020, during the Black Lives Matter movement resurgence and the public health crisis around COVID, sort of in conversations about like, oh, what does it mean to have this history of like Black public health practice in New Orleans? It's something that one of my students, Jaime Jimenez, also kind of took with him as a area of special inquiry. So to thank him particularly for continuing to resonate with this story and continuing to push me to be. So I mentioned that privilege, power, protection part. This is key in recognizing the importance of ourselves and the identities that we bring in our design justice practices, as well as to kind of framing the histories. Like in the Flint Ridge story, you can see how some of the identities, people, and communities that are in the bottom category here were excluded, harmed, deprived. And I use all these words really partly to say that resources matter a lot when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about justice, the way resources are allocated, the way like deprivation or enrichment is taking place really does matter. And so again, these aren't abstract concepts, like how we allocate our funding, how we prioritize our time and the money associated with it matters a lot. And I encourage us to think about these not only as like individual characteristics that we have, but communities that people are part of. It's kind of both at the same time. All right, our interactive activity number 2. And this will be back in the Padlet for another couple of minutes. What is design justice? What values do you practice in your work? What values do you aspire to practice in your work? And it's by values and principles, so referencing, if you'd like, you can reference the Black space principles and the design justice principles. But also, what values do you find difficult to practice in your work, either personally or because of the system, structures, and institutions through which you have to do it?
Thanks for sharing, folks. Folks are sharing in the Padlet and the value of interdependence and trust.
Mhm.
The conversation around community and people-driven design and implementation. Using the past to inform the future, that came up in the chat.
That is key. We'll give it about another minute.
Someone offered us up some African philosophy, Ubuntu, which is, the concept of interconnectedness. I am because we are. So thanks for who posted that in there. And another one, which some other wisdoms, I might say this wrong, but Sawubona, which is I see you, we see you.
One thing I really like about design justice frameworks is that it allows us to bring in cultural practices and concepts from wherever we are, whatever places we associate with, wherever kind of we draw our strength from. And so like many of what a lot of what I've shared has been kind of connected to this place of New Orleans and Louisiana and the places that it's connected to. But you can do this for anywhere that you are practicing. I think that place-based kind of philosophy can really build some deep relationship that are necessary for getting this work done. Because when you're not doing like public health practice, design practice, you're also just a place. And um, we we have to separate ourselves from the work sometimes, but then we're also doing the work with people we're in community with. So I think we're going to move on into one of our reflections portion. And close out. And I apologize, I think we're going to go a little bit over 115, but we shouldn't go beyond 130. I include this photo to frame our reflections and discussion kind of closing portion, partly because Omar, one of our wonderful organizers here from Partners for Health Equity, is in it. But also because this is a great example of kind of what this design thinking for framework can look like. This was a design thinking for Black maternal health workshop that was facilitated by Dr. Tyra Gross of Xavier University of Louisiana here in New Orleans, who's standing there in the back by the wall. And Dr. Gross, who is a practitioner of public health at Xavier, who's thinking about Black maternal health and how to improve Black maternal health outcomes in Louisiana, uses design thinking in her work partly as a way of drawing more people in and examining like creative approaches in a field that's really been stymied by centuries of really intense racist disinvestment, malinvestment, and discrimination. And attending this workshop that Dr. Gross put on, even though we did dig into those histories, left me feeling very hopeful about what's possible, because I think the design justice framework was important for that. It's also like a way of celebrating what successes people have that we're already working on. So we have this opportunity in the Padlet. I think in the interest of kind of coming to a close a little bit more timely, we might give it like 2 minutes. But we'd love to see some responses.
Share some from before that folks brought up already. Appreciate you all jumping in there.
Awesome.
Education systems, particularly thinking about neurotypical students and faculty, teachers, to K through 12, the prison and incarceration system, absolute capitalism. Yes, certainly capitalism.
Yeah, this can be tough questions the larger scale we work on. I find sometimes it's easier to think like, well, what can we do about it on a more local scale? But being an effective practitioner at this work also requires recognizing being able to map power across scales. Unless like Joe Biden's here, which if so, hey, hope he can do something about this.
Yeah, even, as folks are coming here from their own institutions, I shared this with students yesterday in the class I teach, like how local the work of kind of health is in the United States. That's actually where most of the dollars that come from the federal government are spent, is at the local levels. So yeah, I appreciate you uplifting that.
We will take it on into our closing. I got to cut this part for time, but we've had some really great questions going back and forth in the chat, so I am not worried about that at all. Closing and next steps. This photo is drawn from one of our wonderful readings. It is a photo taken by the author reading, Dr. Jan Jones Allen. So we did it. We're at the end of the first one. Take a moment to breathe again. If you like, share in the chat a word that describes an emotion that you're feeling. Energized, grateful, wonderful. Seeing some good words. It was like people are enthusiastic. Felt like y'all learned some things. Conservative too. Yeah, there's a lot of heavy, weighty subjects in here, and though I mentioned like being hopeful, I kind of carry both those things with me. All right. So, in review, we defined the terms design thinking and design justice. We described some of the historical context in which these steps came about. Um, we talked about values that we bring to our work in public health and other fields. And we did a little bit of description of the systems that we work within, who benefits from them, and who's harmed. This is the same end of workshop survey that Michaela just shared in the chat. If you haven't already clicked on it, you can pull out your phone and you can screenshot or QR code shot it now. If someone who has done that wouldn't mind letting us know if it worked, that would also be really great. Michaela has just shared it again. Thank you. All right, what's next? I think this slide might also be in the Padlet. These blue things should work as links, so you'll be able to open them up. Yes, thank you, Mary. We got Dr. Diane Jones-Allen's Living Freedom Through the Maroon Landscape, which is a really, really fascinating story out of the world of landscape architecture, which is what Dr. Allen does, about how people who lived in the swamps around New Orleans, sort of during the era of enslavement, who escaped from enslavement and lived with indigenous people in those lands, how they used the landscape to survive and thrive, especially from a health perspective, like what plants, what things did they find in the swamps that helped sustain them in an era when they were living kind of under the intense challenges of both like being fugitives from enslavement and then also living in a new land. Dr. Justin Hosby's Refusing Unlivable Destinies. He's talking a little bit about New Orleans in the context of post-Katrina and that era, the political and social movements here have refused the idea that New Orleans is worthless or not a place to continue kind of organizing in and fighting for. Dr. Sylviane Diouf, who's writing Maroons. This is also a podcast episode, so it's a great listen. Is digging into some of the history that Dr. Allen's talking about as well. And then Dr. Jim Downs, who is a really, really great historical writer on public health, and his book on a new origin story of public health. Actually, it's either just come out or I'm not sure if it's out yet, but in this video, he's talking about the book, and I found it very interesting to think about the connections between the history of public health, the history in the United States context in particular, the history of the transatlantic trade and enslaved people, and how those are very tightly linked. All right, we will be back in just over a month after Mardi Gras for session 2 in the swamp, where we're going to deepen our about design thinking and design justice and their applications to health equity work within, but not limited to, the New Orleans context. So really hope if you make it through Mardi Gras, you'll join us for that. Tell a friend. Love to see more folks here as well. And thank you for attending our first workshop.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for coming. You'll hear from us. You'll hear from us.
And you will get
Thank
the
you for the thank
slides.
yous. Appreciate you all coming. Thank you for all the thank yous, seeing them in the chat.